please let the participants in?
Yes, Atin, I think we will be joining now.
Sure. Okay. Okay, warm welcome, colleagues, and thank you so much for joining us today. I am Atin, and I'm your host today with my colleague Siddharth from Center for Science and Environment, and Miko Alino and Devyani Khare from Break Free from Plastic. This is the second webinar in the run-up to the fifth and final Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee meeting in Busan, South Korea, end of this month to deliver the much-awaited Global Plastic Treaty. We have one more webinar scheduled on the 19th, where we are going to release our report that map all the countries of the world and the position that each and every nation have taken on different elements of the draft legal agreement instrument that is available till now. So do register for that event as well. I shall post the link in the chat box as soon as the discussion begins. Now, let me try and present a quick context to the discussion we are going to have today. The ongoing INC negotiation is revolving around different elements of the draft instrument, ranging from environmental and health aspect of plastic, marine litter, chemicals used in plastic, problematic plastic, product design, waste management, financial mechanism to support, the low and middle income countries in managing and dealing with the plastic pollution. The UNEP Financial Initiative estimates that intervention focused on systemic change and dealing with the single-use plastic production could cost up to US $1.64 trillion. Now, the developing countries, meanwhile, face a significant financing gap up to US $500 billion for implementing safe waste management infrastructure, supporting reuse model, ensure just transition for the informal workers, cleaning up the legacy plastic waste, and addressing the human health aspect. Now, the bigger question is what should be the finance mechanism and where the money should come from. There are many considerations, however, that have been currently deliberated on the negotiation floor. The most common financing instrument as we speak is the EPR, which is currently being implemented in different parts of the world, including India, which is compatible with the planetary boundaries. Apart from EPR, there are instruments like plastic credit model, plastic pollution fees that could also feature in the mechanism. And we are going to contemplate all of them as much as possible today in presence of an amazing pool of researchers and practitioners who are going to reflect on the agenda for the webinar today. We shall introduce all of them to you when we invite them to speak. And we are extremely grateful to colleagues representing Break Free from Plastic. And today we are going to unfold two new reports from them and talk about it. Let me just try and give a quick visual of the reports that we are going to be talking about from BFFP. Yeah, there you go. So I hope you can see my, sorry, if this is not the one. Yeah, got it. So I hope you can see my screen. So the two reports that you can see on the left of the screen, Rethinking Sachet, Optimizing EPR System for Single-Use Packaging, and Extended Producer Responsibility Compatible with Planetary Boundaries are the two reports that we are going to be releasing and talking about today. The two reports that you can see on the right are the reports that we have already released a couple of weeks back. I guess Siddharth, my colleague Siddharth, is going to reflect on these two reports and what are the key findings when Siddharth takes the floor. So now some housekeeping announcement, just formalities. So the webinar is divided into largely three sections. In the first section, speakers will talk about different EPR models, and then we'll do a quick Q&A session with all the participants. And that will be moderated by Miko and Devyani. In the second part, we shall hear about the financing instrument other than the EPR model. And then followed by that, we will do one more round of Q&A, and we'll practically open up the floor so that both participants and speakers can reflect on the discussion that we are going to have today. Let me now invite the first speaker for the day and hand over the floor. So the first speaker for the day that we have with us is Dr. Dominic Hogg, who is the director of Equanimator. Dr. Hogg has an honors degree in physics, a master's in development economics, and a PhD in economics. He has been involved in environmental issue as a campaigner, researcher, and consultant for more than 35 years. He established UNOMIA Research and Consulting in 2001, where he was chairman until 2020. He now carries out research and consultancy as Equanimator. He has worked on design and evaluation of extended producer responsibility since 1996. His experience regarding EPR spans schemes across European Union countries as well as in the US, Canada, and other jurisdictions. He has also worked on the design of deposit refund schemes in different jurisdictions. Whilst at UNOMIA, he led the company's work for the European Commission and supporting the development of the legislative part of the circular economy package, the introduction of the single-use plastic directive, and the EU plastic strategy. So thank you, Dr. Hogg, for joining us today. The floor is now yours.
Thank you so much, Atin, and welcome everybody. It's fairly early in the morning where I am, but I think it's probably afternoon for most of you, if I'm not mistaken. So allow me just to, let me just share the right screen. Apologies. And before I start as well, I'd just like to say a few thanks to Miko Alinho, who of course has been a great help to me as I've carried out the work, and also to the many people who helped to, who contributed to sort of peer reviewing the work I was doing as it was going, and enabled me to improve my understanding of what was going on in the various countries that we looked at. So I'm going to put up now just a sort of overview of the report structure as we undertook it, and you'll see that there's quite a lot in this report, and it's a lengthy report, but the key focus is on the 4 countries: India, Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam, and exactly what those schemes are designed to do, how they seem to likely to work in the future, and whether they might be improved. And we started the work very much focused on sachets and trying to understand how the EPR schemes could affect sachets. Well, for various reasons, I suspect they're not going to have a strong effect on sachets. We can come on to that. And we'll talk about what sort of measures we might need to address sachets in different countries. And then I want to come on to some lessons for other countries considering EPR, certainly in the context of the INC and the upcoming negotiations in Busan. And I myself have been at both the Paris and the Ontario meetings, numbers 2 and 4. So just to move this slide on then, what are the key, I want to go through some key issues first. What does the EPR mean? Well, to me, the clue is in the name: extended producer responsibility. What responsibilities of businesses are we extending? They already have, to a large degree, responsibility for a range of different things that they do. But in virtually all countries, unless there is something that looks a little like EPR in place, they're not responsible for covering the full costs of managing either the products or the packages that they place on the market when they end up in the waste stream. So very simply, for me, an EPR scheme looks to extend the responsibility of businesses to paying for the management of the stuff that ends up as waste at the end of its life. Now, we can go on and talk about all sorts of other things that we would think it was desirable to do with packaging or with plastics. But we don't necessarily have to address those through EPR. We could address them through various other policy instruments that we don't call EPR. And I think we sometimes risk confusing matters when we do that. The second thing I want to emphasize is the relationship between waste management and EPR. So if we look at, for example, plastics at the moment, just suppose that we decided that we needed to, and I think we probably do, try to collect all plastic waste so that it doesn't get discarded into the environment, into rivers, into oceans, or be burnt. You know, if we're going to collect it, what's going to happen to it? Well, at the moment, we certainly know that we're not going to be able to recycle 100% of it everywhere. Nobody's doing that. So something's going to have to happen with what's left over. Now, it's very rare that EPR law specifies exactly what has to happen to the materials it's covering when it ends up as waste. More usually, all of that rests in either waste management law or other parts of legislation, but not in EPR law. And if I was to look across the world, and people often do this, and they do studies saying, oh, is EPR doing well or badly in this country or that country? How effective is it? And they'll sometimes look just at the EPR system. But that's a mistake, because you'll struggle to find an EPR system that's really working well that isn't supported by a really good waste management system. It's possible to have a really good waste management system without EPR, but it's very difficult to have a really good EPR system without a really good waste management system. So in the work we did, I was very keen to look both at the EPR law and the waste management system. And so then what does that mean then about prevention, reuse, recycled content? You might say, Dominic, are you saying these are not important? Yes, I'm absolutely saying they're important. But what I'm saying is they don't necessarily have to be addressed. And perhaps they are difficult to address sometimes in EPR systems, and that actually we might need other policies, and it might be sensible to use other policies rather than trying to address these through extended producer responsibility systems. So here's some key recommendations. So in the 4 countries we looked at, in both India and the Philippines, the focus is on plastics only. I don't sort of quite understand that, because I think if I want a good waste management system and I do things that might end up putting a focus on one material without looking at the whole waste management system, I can risk fragmenting that system. I can risk introducing inefficiency within it. And by the way, if, as I suggested at the start, the intention is to cover the costs of end-of-life management of waste, why would I only ask the businesses using plastic to do that? Why would I not ask the businesses using other materials to do that also? Lots of the systems include exemptions for typically medium, small enterprises. It's important, I think, to try and keep those exemptions to a minimum as far as possible. It might be, for various reasons, that it's difficult to ensure that the smaller businesses are covered by these measures. So it's possible, again, that they might need to be dealt with through complementary measures. But at the very least, in my view, they should be asked to report data, because otherwise we don't know what's going on. The targets in the legislation should indicate clear progression over time. But the targets are interesting because, again, going back to the links with waste management, if my waste management law makes local government responsible for waste collection from households and so forth, and I think in all countries it does, in all the 4 countries we looked at, then if your targets under EPR are going to go up over time, then unless the collection service can support that, then it's going to be very difficult for those targets to be met. So again, this is a classic case where the read across between what's happening in the waste management law and what's happening in the EPR law needs to be really clear. But in the cases we've got In India, there's some targets that are looking quite challenging as they go forward. In the Philippines, the targets are rather strangely set. They're set for reducing plastic footprint, but that can include just about anything other than dumping, including sort of proper disposal, as it were, sanitary disposal. So it's not clear that it's requiring businesses to do anything other than what local government is required to do in the law anyway. In Vietnam, the targets are only set for 3 years ahead, which is not a very long period in time for people looking to invest. They're not very challenging, I would suggest. In the 3rd year, they might go up subsequently. Let's hope so. But I think people need to see the trajectory that's expected to be achieved over time. And in Indonesia, in my view, the law is not so well drafted, and it really could do with another look at how that law is being presented. Going back to the point about Philippines and Indonesia, there's sort of equal weight in those targets being given to contributions that have very different outcomes. So, for example, you get the same credit in your, as far as I can see, from your for reducing your plastic footprint, whether you're co-incinerating or recycling. And the difference between or incineration, for example, and the difference between incinerating plastic and putting it into a closed loop recycling is probably about 3 or 4 tons of CO2 per ton of plastic that you're switching from the one to the other. The measurement of the key performance outcomes should be clear. So if you've got a recycling target, what do you mean by recycling? When are you going to measure it? You're going to measure it when the stuff gets delivered to the input to a particular facility. At what point are you going to measure recycling? Because unless you've made that absolutely clear, then it's not entirely, you're going to have problems understanding performance, and indeed people might over-declare performance when they're not doing what they're saying they should be doing. Not doing what they should be, rather. The number of routes to compliance should be limited. I mean, again, Vietnam, other countries, lots of different routes to compliance that businesses can choose. Put yourself in the position of a regulator trying to understand whether businesses are complying, the whole of the country. Now, it'd be far easier if you just had one route to comply and the regulator had to look at that one particular route and said, is everyone doing this? But if there's several different routes and they got to check that businesses are not doing any one of them, and if those imply any level of bureaucratic checking, then that's going to be a significant burden for the regulator, and it's going to be quite difficult to understand who is and isn't complying. That's complicated further when those performance outcomes are sort of including lots of different activities that could count towards compliance. Some of the countries have got good sanctions for non-compliance, at least on paper. It's not clear that they're necessarily, as far as the evidence I can see from a distance, as it were, it's not clear that they're always being applied. For example, non-registration of businesses. Where are the sanctions for that? They're there on paper, but are they actually being implemented? And just on that point about sanctions, by the way, EPR is very much prone to fraudulent declarations, misdeclarations, and so forth. Almost embedded within the system is a tendency for people to be, should we say, not wholly truthful. And so the design of the system has to recognize that and has to actually put in place the sort of sanctions and the sort of regulatory measures to actually deal with it. And indeed, one of the things that businesses should pay for under EPR is to partly fund that regulatory apparatus that actually enables that enforcement to happen. The law has to be well drafted. This sounds pretty fundamental, but I'm afraid it's not always the case in the countries, in my view, that I've been looking at. And I understand why that's the case. In some cases, first of all, EPR, lots of people say, oh, can you keep it simple, Dominic? Can you keep it simple? Do you know what? The law is often quite complicated. It doesn't have to be, but it often is. And it has to be well drafted in terms of responsibilities. And I always put myself in the position of a business that might ideally not want to do anything from its point of view. And
Dominic,
when
a good wrap up now, please. Thank
yeah,
you.
and if I'm one of those businesses who's in that situation, then and I think the law enables me to, as it were, not do anything, then I'm in a good position. Businesses should cover full net costs of end-of-life management. Credit-based schemes generally don't achieve this because they're not designed to achieve it. They're designed to basically acquire evidence of compliance. And just to show this, what's happened over time in the EU, we now in law require all of these things to be covered by businesses under EPR. Under the Single-Use Plastic Directive for specified items, we also recover these. We also need these costs to be recovered, and the Framework Directive on Waste allows these costs to be covered, and some nations are covering those as well. Get the costs covered. We need better financing of waste management. And so the final point here on the recommendations, and it's important because we started off looking at sachets, the EPR might not affect sachets because typically there are targets for perhaps flexible packaging, so it depends on the extent to which sachets are make up that category of flexible packaging. So you need alternative measures if you're going to really deal with sachets. And we might look at bans on some specific uses. So, for example, in hotels and so forth, and in cafes and restaurants. And in other contexts, levies, taxes to incentivize the phase out over time for those others. And if those levies escalate over time to send a market signal that we want these off the market, then I think that's an interesting way to go. And it will also raise further revenue for the Exchequer. I'll leave it there. Look forward to receiving questions, and thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dominic. It was really insightful. I know we have a lot to talk about, but time is short, so I'll request all the panelists to restrict their intervention in time. Let me now bring in the second panelist for the day. So we have with us Jean-Marc Simon, Director, Founder, Zero Waste Europe. John is a social entrepreneur and author with 20 years long experience in zero waste in the European Union policies. He founded Zero Waste Europe in 2011, serves as steering committee member of Break Free from Plastics and board member of the Mission Zero Academy. He published many articles and books on the topic of zero waste and circular economy and led initiatives to implement zero waste solutions, such as zero waste certification for cities and businesses, or several reuse initiatives. He has worked on policies and implementation of EPR and deposit refund schemes since 2015. Thank you so much, Jean-Marc, for joining us today. The floor is yours. You have about 10 minutes to intervene. Thank you.
All right. So hello, everyone, and thanks for the invitation. I'll try to keep up with the 10 minutes, and it's a mission impossible. So I really recommend you to read the studies that both Dominic and I have drafted. So the study I did is about extended producer responsibility within planetary boundaries, and what I did there is look at the experience we have had in Europe, since we have more than 30 years of experience with EPR implementation, legislation, etc., and look what are the learnings that we can extract from this implementation experience, and how can that be useful for the implementation of EPR in other parts of the world. So I will start with an analysis of the situation. First of all, when we look at waste generation, the fact is that when we look at waste generation per capita, this has increased in the European Union for packaging, for electronic and electronic products placed in the market, for weed collection, etc. So this is a fact. However, the fact that the waste generation has increased might or might not be related to EPR. There's other parts of the world where you have seen actually plastic waste generation increase and EPR was not there in place. So the fact that there's correlation doesn't mean that there is causality. And we have had eco-modulation of EPR fees, but that hasn't delivered much yet. The second point is that if we look at EPR and the impact on reuse, it is true that extended producer responsibility doesn't legislate on reuse, but it has had an impact on that. And if we look at the fact that in Europe we have the waste hierarchy mandating that reuse comes before recycling, the fact that we have had legislation on EPR since now some decades and no legislation or targets whatsoever on reuse has resulted in actually reuse falling across the board. And this is true when we look at the rest of the world. So if you look at the reusable quotas in the rest of the world have gone down. And the same is true in Europe. The only place in Europe where reuse quotas have been maintained is in Germany, and this is thanks to the fact that Germany actually set some reuse quotas to be maintained. So that is also a fact that first talking about EPR without talking about reuse will mean that you will build infrastructure for single use and not for reuse, which is going to like push reuse even more down. Also, what is the relationship between EPR and deposit and refund systems? The fact is that experience shows that DRS are the most effective and efficient way to achieve high collection rates and also preserve reusable packaging in the market. However, in Europe, we haven't had any mention or any obligation on DRS in EU legislation until 2024. 30 years later, at the beginning of packaging EPR legislation. Also at the global level, there's lots of talk about EPR, but not much about DRS. So that's why I think a learning here is that any institution considering to implement EPR should include DRS as DRS is a type of EPR. So unless there are systems in place which deliver like really high separate collection rates, let's make sure that any EPR consideration includes DRS from the outset. EPR and cost coverage. The fact is, as Dominic has said, like there is no perfect EPR coverage anywhere in the world. And the fact is also that the more inefficient the EPR system is, the cheaper it is for producers. So it's no surprise that producers will try to do as little as possible and pay for as little as possible. And that's why in Europe we have had more and more legislation putting more and more responsibility on producers. But the fact is that no EPR system fully internalizes costs today. And the higher the collection rates, the more internalization, which also like explains why in so many countries we have EPR that actually doesn't require much high collection rates. Then there's a topic about the challenges with current interpretation of implementation of EPR. Then it's true that it's just a tool in the toolbox of waste management. However, what we have seen is that since it manages to mobilize so much money from the industry, it creates the producer responsibility organizations, which actually mobilize more funding than the ministry even has, and that exerts political influence. These PROs intervene in policy negotiations. They create an illusion of control as well, because they will say that we collect your waste, it's going to be recycled. That's not necessarily true. Take yogurt pots, for example, they're going to be collected because they paid for. That doesn't mean it's going to be recycled, but it can give this illusion. And it also locks the system into waste management, which leads to what I call the EPR paradox, which means that we are creating a system which is supposed to solve the problem and might actually end up institutionalizing waste generation, because again, there's for some waste streams, like take plastic bags. For plastic bags, many countries in the world didn't implement an EPR system. They just decided to ban them. So there's other instruments, and not everything needs to be EPR. So is it time to change the narrative? The polluter pay principle, which is basically where EPR is based, it states the necessity to have the polluter pay. But the truth is that today they don't pay enough. And even if they would pay, does this mean that that would be enough? The polluter pays should not be seen as a right to pollute. And that's why in the study, I actually put some proposals on how to make EPR operate within planetary boundaries. Not that planetary boundaries need to be part of EPR, but EPR needs to be part of this bigger waste management legislation, and also needs to be coherent with other policies such as climate or material resources policies. So first of all, EPR needs to be compatible with waste reduction. That doesn't mean that EPR needs to contribute directly, but the fact is that all other things being equal, the only way EPR can help reduce environmental impact is either by collecting and recycling waste at rates higher than the waste generated, or by having stable or declining waste generation, and while growing recycling. So there's tools there that actually need to be set in parallel to EPR. For example, in the European Union, the last packaging regulation included prevention targets. So actually by 2040, we need to reduce 15% of packaging waste. That is useful next to EPR because actually that informs and also provides guidance for the investors and the brands because they know they need to reduce. Second is making EPR to be a tool to increase or shift to reuse. We are seeing more and more examples of how actually EPR, which is a tool that is supposed to finance waste management, is being used to finance reuse. Like a big example is France. So in there, we need to also be careful because producers should be paying for the creation of reuse infrastructure, but that doesn't mean that they need to be running this infrastructure. So they can play this role, but we need a good regulatory framework defining the role and targets, as well as proper oversight of the operations of the PROs. And in those places in the world where actually the PROs are not in place, maybe we can come up with more creative solutions on actually how to create reuse systems that solve the problem without actually having to go through EPR. And then there's the governance of EPR, what I was talking about, creating this kind of political animal. I think it's important that EPR systems are designed to prevent the use of strategic position and this powerful position that the industry would have by having the producer responsibility organization to make sure that all stakeholders are represented, that there's transparency criteria allowing public opinion to monitor the governance, there's proper reporting of PRO operations, and discourage any attempts from PROs to shift blame or responsibility onto consumers. So just to sum up, we have seen that EPR is a useful tool for mobilizing resources, and that is a fact when the legislation provides the right guidance. Not all EPR is the same, but so it has potential, but it's, I think, so far untapped. The use of EPR during the last decades has not prevented the increase of waste generation. It has not supported reuse, and it has not made producers really responsible for the products and packaging they place in the market. That doesn't mean that that's a role of EPR, but that's why we need waste management legislation and other policies to complement EPR. EPR cannot be seen in isolation. Thirdly, in terms of fostering eco-design, EPR has so far not managed to increase the recyclability or circularity of products. Rather the opposite. We have seen actually more plastics, more complex materials, more actually difficulty to recycle. And just to conclude, I think we need to look at the future of EPR, not in actually institutionalization of waste management, but actually how do we ensure that EPR contributes to a framework that contributes to resource efficiency and a just transition. And that's my intervention. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, John Mark. This was truly very insightful. I can already see a few questions popped up in the Q&A box. Let me now invite the third speaker for the day, Siddharth, and quickly introduce him. And I would request Miko and Alino to moderate the rest of the discussion after Siddharth has made his presentation, take questions as much as possible and do the rest. So Siddharth is a program manager at the Center for Science and Environment. An engineer by training, he holds a master's degree in green technology from the Institute of Chemical Technology, Mumbai. With nearly a decade of experience in the solid waste management sector, Siddharth previously co-founded a social enterprise dedicated to organic waste management in CSE. in Mumbai. At CSE, he works with the solid waste management and circular economy unit, primarily focusing on plastic pollution. Siddharth has been involved in several government committees contributing to policy development on waste management and circularity at the national and state level. He leads CS's initiative on plastic waste, overseeing research, advocacy, and capacity building efforts. So on this note, Siddharth, thank you so much. I'll just help you to make your presentation by quickly uploading it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Atin. Let me see if this works. Yeah. So, okay. So we did two reports, mostly focusing on the EPR regime in India. The first report basically looks at what the policy says and what's actually happening on the ground. And the law also mandates formation of a portal where all the polluters and all the plastic waste processors should register. Now, as basically pointed by the previous speakers, in India's case also, the EPR regime or the guidelines basically leverage the existing plastic waste management value chain. So as you can see, PBOs or polluters introduce plastic packaging in the market. It serves its mean service life, after which it enters into the waste management stream. And then there are multiple fates that a plastic product or a plastic waste can basically meet. It can either go to the dump site, or it can be actually managed, go to a junk shop or a material recovery facility, and some recovery happens from the dump site, and everything essentially flows either to an end of life disposal option, so something like a waste to energy or a cement co-processing plant, or it goes into mechanical recycling process. Now, what the Indian EPR does is it asks all the PBOs. PBO stands for producers, importers, and brand owners. Essentially, this is all the people who are polluters. They have to register on the portal, which is developed by the Ministry of Environment, Forest, Climate Change. The plastic recyclers and the end-of-life managers also have to register on this portal, right? And after their registration, basically, the polluters are assigned targets for collection, for recycling, for use of recycled content, and the processors and recyclers are allowed to start issuing certificates. So that is how the entire EPR system in India basically is designed in a nutshell. And then after the credits or the certificates are generated by the plastic waste processors, they can be traded between the processors and the polluters. And there is some space for ULBs, for MRF operators to actually come into. So essentially, what we are looking at is 5 categories of waste. It is not the typical universally accepted resin identification code on which the EPR system is based, but it is rather divided into physical characteristics of the plastic. So it can be rigid, it can be flexible, having, let's say, multiple layers of different kinds of polymers. It can be multi-layered, having more than one type of material itself. So let's say there's a layer of paper, there's a layer of plastic, there's a layer of metal. So that's category 3. And then we have compostable and biodegradable as category 4 and 5. Now the targets for collection, for recycling, for each of these categories is different. Now, one thing that we have to note is while the EPR system in India is limited to plastic packaging, an exception has been made for compostable and biodegradable plastics. For these two categories, category 4 and 5, any commodity. So even if you're, let's say, making a cup, or let's say you're making something else from compostable or biodegradable plastic, they will be covered under the EPR legislation in India. And for the remaining 3 categories, that is for rigid, flexible, and multi-layered, what you will have is essentially just for limited to packaging. Now, these are the collection. What you see on the top left are collection targets. What you see on the top right is the recycling targets, and these are designated as per plastic packaging categories. So for this fiscal year, so in India, the fiscal year runs from April 2024 to March 2025 next year. So as we can see, all the blue bars on the graph on the top right, for rigid plastics, the recycling targets for this year is 50%. For flexible and multi-layered, it stands at 30%. Right. So this is essentially what we're talking about. Now, what we also did is we downloaded a lot of data from the portal, from the centralized portal that is developed by the ministry. And what we found is of the polluters, there are more than 40,000 polluters. This data is till 15th August 2024. Of all the polluters, we have about 11% are producers, around 6% are brand owners, and around 83% are importers, right? But what we find is the producers are actually the ones who are introducing the most into the Indian market. 65% of all the plastic packaging that is introduced on the Indian market comes from producers and not from importers, who the absolute number is the highest. The other thing that I want you to actually notice is category 2 plastic. So flexible plastic, if you actually look at it, this is the highest circulated plastic in the Indian market. And there are also a few other problems associated with which I will try to reflect on when and if time permits. In terms of plastic waste processors, these are again divided into two different categories. The first one is mechanical recycling. So we have about 3,500 odd mechanical recyclers who are either making pellets or making products from the particular category. And we have another end-of-life disposal option. We have about 150 units, but look at the distinction. I mean, the end-of-life disposal units are actually dealing with 61%, or they have the capacity to deal with the overall capacity. 60% is attributed to end-of-life disposal, which is for options like waste to oil, waste to energy, co-processing. Now, all of these units are generating certificates, and they can generate certificates as per the capacity that they have been assigned by the regulator. But what we found in our analysis is all the end-of-life disposal options were actually producing certificates that were much, much, much more than what their actual capacity was. So, for instance, if you look at co-processing, they claim to have generated 3,000% more certificates and probably already traded with polluters in India, right? So this is a basic fundamental flaw of the certification mechanism. Now, if we look at what the recycling targets for this fiscal year are and what the recycling capacity, mechanical recycling capacity of the country is, we find that category 2 plastics are already circulated in a much higher quantity than our recycling capacity for this category. So we are already running short of about 30%. And for category 4, which, the quantity is not very high, recycling targets just stand at 0.03 million tons. But if you look at the recycling infrastructure, we are putting almost 700% more of this plastic than the capacity that we have to deal. In fact, we have just one industrial composting facility in the entire country that is kind of nestled in the westernmost part of the country. And transporting waste from India is a big, diverse country, so transporting would come at a cost. Now, just to run you through the key findings, we did not find any manufacturers of virgin plastic polymers, although the law mandates them to feature on this portal. None of them have registered. EPR for plastic packaging in the country has been reduced to just trading certificates. There is absolutely no ground action. And because the law basically says that, once you procure the certificates, your compliance is met, right? So there's absolutely no ground action. from the reports that we have from regulators at both state and central level, we only know the compliance status of 25% of the polluters. So the compliance status of the remaining 75% is absolutely unknown. It's not disclosed. Similarly, only 62% processors compliance status is known. Now, this 62% may have complied, may not have complied, but for the remaining, we have absolutely no idea where they stand. Highest non-compliance was observed for category 2 plastics, which is flexible, and it is also the highest circulated. There was an amendment. Now, this amendment, this notification that came in 2022 has been amended as many as 5 times. And the last amendment that happened in March this year has reclassified a problematic category of plastic into category 2. Right. So what basically this does is, and I know as many as 50 different cities across the country who are struggling to manage this waste. This is basically, we find our chips, our biscuit and even our shampoo sachets in this multi-layer packaging, which have a inner layer of aluminium. This has been reclassified, and due to which basically what we are telling them is you can go and incinerate your plastic waste. You don't necessarily need to change your design. You don't necessarily need to focus on mechanical recycling.
Did you need to wrap up now?
Yeah, just 1 minute. What we found is through 2 case studies that polluters are only paying at max 10% of the total cost that actually is needed to manage plastic waste. And there are malpractices of certificates, fake certificates moving around the corner, due to which the certificate prices have hit a rock bottom. Can you mute yourself? And what we basically recommend is disincentivizing problematic formats like sachets, like multi-layer packaging, establishing a fair pricing, although an attempt has been made by the regulators, but again, it is stuck at 10% right now. Revising compliance mandates, we need more ground action. We need people to, polluters to put more money to actually collect and recycle channelized waste. And until and unless we invalidate almost 1 million certificates that are available, we will not be able to fix the prices of the EPR certificates, which will actually put the accountability back on the polluters. So that's it from my side. I'm sorry if I've overshot, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Siddharth. And all of the panelists so far, I think this has been a lot to take in. And may I request the audience, after this session is done, please take a look at the link, go through the reports. They are long reports, but they are making solid recommendations, and perhaps they can answer some of the questions we may not have time to answer in the Q&A later. If I may request again, housekeeping, please park your questions in the Q&A box. That's where our hosts and panelists will be able to take a look at them. In the chatter, they can get a little lost. And great. And I would like to pivot this discussion a little and just pause for thought here. Considering that EPR is a relatively technical topic, and the press invites that went out, and most of the audience, we have almost 168 to around 170 members in the crowd right now, we know that this is a topic that you may be familiar with, or that you have heard something about before. So before we proceed to the next session, this was a soundbite from all of the report authors. And next up, we have commentaries about these reports. I would like us to just pause and think of all of what we've heard through a few of these lenses. How do we transform EPR from a waste management tool to a waste prevention mechanism? How can EPR systems be designed to ensure fair practices for waste workers or waste pickers, as well as local governments? And how can EPR systems deliver equitable outcomes in developing economies? So we have had some answers to these questions in the three panelists' talks so far, but I hope that you continue to consider the EPR from these three lenses when you're posing your questions or when you're considering that the EPR can do so much more than just be about waste management. So next up, I'll hand it over to Miko to introduce the commentators, and we can take the discussion forward from here.
Yeah, thanks, Devayani. So maybe just to continue with the discussion, and we're inviting three more speakers to provide commentaries on at least some of the financing schemes that have been generating interest, not just during the treaty negotiations that have been happening the last 2 years, but of course also into the national and regional gatherings or spaces. And to start off, to discuss about plastic credit schemes, we have Arpita. Arpita is the Plastic Policy Officer for Gaia Asia Pacific. Her work focuses on strengthening the capacity and engagement of members in global and national advocacy works towards plastic production caps, advancing zero waste policies, just transition for waste pickers and workers, and phasing out false solutions. Since 2012, she has worked across international and Indian organizations leading public mobilization, advocacy, and movement building campaigns and programs across diverse issues, including clean energy, sustainable agriculture, climate resilient cities, gender justice, and plastics. Arpita, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Miko, and thanks everyone for all of these presentations. I have learned myself a lot, and I'm going to try to be quick and essentially try to unwrap plastic credits, basically looking at the claims that are being made versus what is the reality on the ground that we have found through different reports between Gaia and BFFP. So just to unwrap plastic credits, what are they? They are basically an intangible asset that is sold for a certain amount of money. Next slide. And 1 ton of plastic waste is collected from the environment. It is either recycled, intercepted before it leaks into the environment. And essentially, it falls in the paradigm of voluntary market. There are no government regulations. It's purely done by companies who want to meet their net zero reduction or marketing goals. There is also no globally recognized measure or equivalent for a single plastic credit yet. And the most difficult part is that the complex composition of plastic means that each ton of collected plastic will have varying environmental impacts and cannot be considered equal. So if you're collecting PET versus if you're collecting sachets versus if you're collecting HDPE, we cannot really consider them equal, but credits assume it to be so. Next slide. And I think one of the major pieces that are discussed when we talk about credits, it's carbon credits. And if folks are already familiar with carbon credits and the failure of carbon credits in actually meeting finance goals or even meeting emission goals would know this, and there have been enough analysis done, and here on the screen is an analysis by Guardian. Carbon credits have been used as a blueprint for plastic credits, and it's promoted by the same companies. While carbon markets have a certain protocols that are coming up, plastic credits still lack those. The other issue is that plastic credits can be layered on top of carbon credits. That means for the same activity, polluter can get both a carbon credit and a plastic credit. So there is no transparency and there's no accountability to that. The other problem is also the pricing for each credit is left up to the crediting companies, and we'll see the landscape on that on the following slides, please. There is lack of transparency with respect to information on how these credits are priced, who are the buyers, and how the plastic footprints as they're calculated and verified are done. In the intersessional meetings that were concluded a few months ago for Global Plastics Treaty, the expert group on finance met and discussed a wide variety of financial mechanisms, including private and public finance. But when you look at the co-chair's report, and I hope somebody can post the link here if you've not seen it, it gives priority focus, almost like a sales pitch for innovative finance. And when we hear innovative finance, we know, there are schemes like outcome-based financing, plastic credits, different kind of bonds that are propelled into the forum. And essentially, like we have been discussing for EPR, for this particular kind of mechanism as well, accrediting activities are for collection and recycling, and they're not looking at the upstream. And so you have this landscape where you have projects, developers who are collecting and recycling. There is somebody who looks at the oversight, provides oversight for those projects, sets the price. There are third-party auditors who verify, and there are standard-setting bodies, there are certifications, and then their registry. And then there is a marketplace where, buying and selling of credits happens. Buyers, of course, are companies, polluters who want to offset their pollution. What is important to note is that many of these play multiple roles and overlapping roles, and all of these standards are coming from the companies themselves, are not mandated, are not set by any legitimate body, so to say. On next slide. So basically, who is buying these credits? Of course, these are companies who want to claim they are green, they're plastic neutral. There are companies who want to claim they are net zero. And so in that sense, it's a compensatory measure for polluters who, instead of reducing pollution, instead of actually reducing the amount of plastic they're producing or the amount of emissions they are causing, or shifting to safer plastic, getting rid of toxic chemicals, etc. They're investing in crediting projects and using that information to claim that they are plastic neutral. Next slide, please. And in their own language, by the players themselves, they've defined these three kinds of plastic credits: plastic positive, plastic neutral, plastic negative. And basically, plastic positive means, you're removing plastic waste in excess of what a company has produced. Highly unlikely, but well, there are claims, and of course, the others are pretty self-explanatory. Next slide. And there are over 30 different kind of plastic credit schemes, 30 different standards, and they're all uncoordinated. And it's a voluntary space, it's a growing space, it's a space where you can have multiple credits being issued for the same project as a result of this disparate set of uncoordinated landscape. And on the next slide, so last year around the same time, Gaia and BFFP came together. These are some of the players that we know of. Of course, Vera and Plastic Credit Exchange from the Philippines are the big ones that we looked at. From the report last year, on the next slide, some of the very difficult findings were that, and this is in the words of Repurpose Global itself, that this market is emerging, and at this stage, every institution is following their own protocols that govern the process of creating credits. And this is strange because when we're talking about a global instrument or international instrument, what we are looking for is certain global binding targets, certain global standards, harmonization of policies across the world. And so there needs to be a common playing field, and there needs to be high ambition in terms of what we want to achieve. And these crediting schemes so far, and Siddharth has also talked about Indian EPR and credit schemes, have not proved their merit and have not shown the kind of result we want to see, and essentially are greenwashing in a big way. Next slide. Next slide. So last year, Gaia and BFFP came together to produce this investigative report, Smoke and Mirrors, and we looked at two important creditors to big companies were in plastic credit exchange, only because their data is published online and the rest are difficult to. So kudos to them that their data is available, but that doesn't mean that they are in the good. Many projects were found to be already in operation before these credits were set. So 82% of Vera projects were already established. That means waste pickers were already doing this, because if we are looking at a lot of the projects happening in Asia. And so the money coming in is not creating any additional recovery. It's just paying money that could have gone to waste pickers, to local nonprofits, to local organizations who are doing, who are setting up zero waste system or who are doing cleanup. But now they are going to this variety of mediators who have set up a marketplace for in the sake of credits. And so we could also see what is absolutely crazy is that only 14% of the PCX credits are for recycling and actual recycling. And most of the projects, most of the credits are going for burning plastic. So essentially, going back to the question of, even if we say that plastic credits help in solving the waste management problem and providing funding for that, we need to be cautious about what are we funding really. And by Vera's own estimate, their total revenue by 2030, which is not far away, could be as high as $4.67 billion. And this is what we know. And there are many other players we don't know about. Next slide.
Yeah.
So one of the
wrap up, Arpita. So yeah.
Sorry. So just to quickly try to wrap up, additionality is a big concern. That means that the effort that is being put due to the plastic credits projects should be over and above what is happening anyway, which is hard to prove, and there are serious concerns around that. The other bigger problem on the following slides is that plastic credits are basically incentivizing all of those polluting false technologies instead of incentivizing production reduction, and that is the main demand that we are pushing for. And the other big problem that we've been talking about is how credits are being integrated into policies. So EPR, for example, and that's a big concern. We've seen it in the Philippines EPR law, we've seen it in Indian EPR law, and it continues to go on. And this basically is resulting in a lot of privatization of infrastructure for waste management that should be within the paradigm of local municipalities, so that there is some amount of regulation of what is happening, but that's not the case. Credit-based financing are also discouraging zero waste systems. They are helping in greenwashing, and worst of all is they are supporting waste colonialism in Global South by continuing to push and encourage waste trade across from Global North to Global South. I will end here, but the reports and the points are available in the slides. Thank you so much for listening. Over to you, Miko.
Yeah, thanks, Arpita, for giving us an overview of that report. So if you're interested, I've shared the link to the smoke mirrors report that was released last year. Moving on, I'll call on our next commenter. We have Dharmesh Shah, who is the consulting senior campaigner with CL's Environmental Health Program. His work focuses primarily on strategy, coordination, support, and mobilizing of the diverse coalition of civil society organizations co-leading the efforts to deliver an effective global plastics treaty. So the floor is yours, Dharmesh.
Thank you, Miko, and I hope you can see my screen. And thank you all, especially the organizers, CSE and BFFP, for inviting me to share my thoughts on the plastic pollution fee. So as many of the speakers earlier have already spoken about, the various mechanisms that are being they are being discussed in the context of the Global Plastics Treaty and also by policymakers across the world to mobilize private sector finance. Now, the waste management crisis, or the plastic crisis, as we call it, there's a lot of investments required in end-of-life management and to manage the negative impacts of the plastic pollution crisis, and money is required. And EPR has been a tried and tested kind of a mechanism. We've heard from John Mark about how it has been there for 30 years in the European Union, the challenges that EPR is facing, and also complexities in implementation in countries like India and Philippines, which have integrated EPR into national policies on waste management. So certainly there's a lot of complexities around how EPR has evolved over the past several decades. Now, the plastic pollution fee is a mechanism that is being discussed at this point in the plastics treaty space. This was first proposed by Ghana in the Intergovernmental Negotiation Committee, the second session of the INC. And the idea behind this plastic pollution fee was to impose a small fee to help all the developing countries to mobilize finance to address the gaps, funding gaps on 5 key elements: waste management, circular transition or circular economy transition, cleanup of legacy plastics, plastic waste, just transition, and the health impacts of plastic pollution. The idea was to close the recognition. There was recognition that EPR alone or even plastic credits, even if it's implemented, with all the flaws that Arpita spoke about, it will never be enough to raise enough funding or to close the financing gap that is required to fund some of these elements of the plastic pollution crisis. This complements other sources of finance, which includes overseas development assistance, extended producer responsibility, and other private sector sourced funds. Very important to note that the fee is a financing instrument. It is not a control measure. It was earlier presented as a control measure, but it is a financing instrument. It is based on the polluter pays principle, which is similar to the EPR, which seeks to raise money from the polluters. This doesn't have any negative impact on the price of plastic products, which was a main concern for many of the countries that were discussing this in the plastics treaty negotiations. Now, just to give you a breakup of how much money can be raised through the plastic pollution fee. After EPR and private finance, if the fee is also imposed, we can raise about 25 to 35 billion per year from the polymer fee alone. And this is the allocation that has been done. Of course, these are based on calculations that the authors of this report have developed. This has some basis. I can share the report in the chat later. But this is the general distribution of funding or money that can go to the various sectors from after it's raised from the pollution fee. Now, the fee is about $60 to $90 per ton on polymers or less than 1% on finished goods. It will be collected it should be collected by national governments and not by a global entity. So if India is collecting it, it will change the laws here and collect that money from the primary plastic producers, which is very different from what the sector that EPR targets, which I'll come to a bit later. It is, as I said, it's based on the polluter pays principle, which kind of levels the playing field when it comes to companies across the life cycle of plastics. There is a burden sharing across the supply chain because EPR is focused on a certain sector only. The fee will also include the plastic producers. So it will also ease the burden on a certain sector, which is right now funding a lot of the waste management implementation. So it complements other sources, like I said, and it also the revenue is a portion of the revenue is retained by the country that is collecting it and is redistributed, and this redistribution is based on the common but differentiated responsibility. So countries that are developing will retain a larger portion of the share that they collect, and remainder of it goes to an international mechanism, which will then be redistributed. So this is mindful of the fact that different countries have different requirements when it comes to implementation challenges. And this will also address free riding by non-parties. There's a provision in that as well. There's a major benefit of this for producing for developing countries. As I said, the retained share, a majority of the retained share is with a country that is, if it's a developing country, and the redistribution share is moderated based on the common but differentiated responsibility principle. Developing countries are net recipients. So majority of the countries that are currently facing the plastics crisis will be the net recipients under this regime. The revenue that's generated from this will be a win-win, and it will fund pollution costs. It'll assist industry in transition to sustainable plastics economy and support transition to sustainable production and alternatives. Create opportunities in waste management, industry, circular economy, and it's going to be key to access to developed markets, example EU. And rush to some of the slides. So this was the point I wanted to make earlier. The fee is a complementary mechanism to the EPR. As I said earlier, EPR alone is not going to be enough to raise the money that we need, and it is not to replace the EPR mechanism. The EPR is imposed on brand owners and distributors, what Siddharth refers to as PIBOs, and it is on a different sector of the plastics value chain, and it covers some costs of managing those plastic products nationally. The plastic pollution fee is on the primary plastic producers that are not covered under the EPR. So it's on the virgin polymer producers on the market, and there are only a handful of these guys globally. The fee is also a very simple mechanism to collect money from the primary polymer producers. There are only about 100 plus major producers of polymers across the world, and this makes this process extremely simple to implement. I covered the next cost slide already, and I'll just go through some of the additional points since I have some time, I hope. There were a lot of concerns by countries on how it will impact, what social adverse impacts and economic impacts will a fee like that have. And our analysis shows that the impact is minimal. The expected impact of the fee on final consumer prices is only a fraction of a percent. So if you see the two bar graphs, the small red at the bottom is what will be passed on to the consumers, which is a very, very small percentage of the gross national income per capita, which is, the assessment is 0.5% to 0.9%. according to the authors of the report. So there's again, those fears can be allayed here. And only there's these three scenarios that have also been analyzed. With business as usual, which is what we're doing right now, mismanaged plastic is going to be about 90%. With an ambitious treaty without a fee, so if the treaty negotiations go well and we have everything that's required for a good treaty, but there's no fee, then we'll have about 50% 50 million metric tons per year mismanaged waste. But with ambitious treaty plus the fee, this number comes down to 10 million metric tons per of mismanaged plastic. Yeah.
It's okay. I'll cut you off. That was right. Maybe you have one last line or message.
Yeah. Okay. So fee level is scalable to needs, and I won't go into this again. This is a redistributed share into different sectors. And that's the end of my slides. Thank you so much.
Right. Thanks, Dharmesh. So yeah, I think we do have time, but we'll try to make it quick. Pinky, if you can maybe give us maybe a reaction to the reports that were presented earlier. Pinky is the Asia Pacific coordinator for Break Free from Plastic, and she has played pivotal roles in initiatives like the Solid Waste Management Roundtable in Bangalore and Hasirudala. Pinky?
Thank you, Miko. So I'm going to quickly summarize, and while summarizing, also react to this report. So I'm going to start with, we've heard about the concept of EPR and the rationale behind EPR. I mean, Dominic started with that. And the reason being that traditional approaches can no longer manage the ever-increasing post-consumer waste. And so this requires producers to pay for the environmental cost of these products. Now, I'm taking Andrew's question from the from the Q&A, which said, what would be the key considerations for implementation and management of regional EPR schemes? And I think looking at all the four reports, what comes to my mind is when designing EPR schemes, what is the vision? What do countries really want from EPR? Is it better public health? Is it waste reduction or diversion or recovery? Is it to make money? Again, a disclaimer here, earning extra revenue is an aspiration that most municipalities chase, but there's nothing wrong in it. However, the question is, do they truly understand what extended producer responsibility means? Or is the vision just financial aid for waste management? And we've heard from Dominic about waste management systems being robust, for EPR systems being robust. But if you're looking at financial aid, what is the amount that you're looking at? Well, how have you arrived at the numbers? What are the calculations, if any? When budgets are made, how are they allocated based on the provisions for zero waste hierarchy? Do you have strict targets for landfill and incineration? How can then EPR really fit the shortfall, and for what aspect? Because we're talking about financial mechanisms, and if you don't have this basic right, how can you even calculate how is the EPR going to bridge that shortfall? On the question of, is EPR incentivizing producers to reduce impact of these products and encourage companies to redesign products for reuse and recyclability rather than disposing them off? The answer to this question is still no, as John Mark mentioned. And why is that? I think at the first glance, if we notice that we have many key definitions that are missing. We don't really have universally accepted definitions for many things. Let's start off with polluter pay. At first sight, we know that the concept is simple. You pollute, you bear the cost. However, when it comes to practical implementation, we've never defined what is considered pollution. Is it existing plastic waste? Is it the garbage dumps? Is it litter? Is it waste from households? Is it industrial discards and emissions from producer? Is it incineration ash? Is it microplastics in our food, water, soil? Who should be responsible for the environmental and human impact of all this, of air, water, land pollution? The problem is, if we have not really agreed upon the definition of a polluter, then how are we even fixing accountability? And that directly relates to the problem of sachets, like Dominic pointed out. We don't have a definition, so how are we even going to address the problem? Targets, guidelines, frameworks. Now, targets, most of us know, are not scientific. And Dominic mentioned about progression. There has to be a progression, and it has to be realistic. But if there is no scientific science-based targets, then how are we even talking about companies reducing plastic pollution? Similarly, if you have targets for reuse, do you have guidelines on operationalizing the same? Are there other enabling policy support that is created? Are we investing in reuse systems, even 10% as we are in petrochemicals? Unsubstantiated statements. Now, we always heard, like when Arpita also was mentioning with her presentation, we will also hear claims like the revenue from the sale of plastic credits is used to support plastic pollution reduction efforts. How? We've not defined it. So how are we even making those kind of statements? If you're talking about CSR, are we again then going just and saying this company has used so much of MLP and created a plastic bench in this particular school, or we've used this amount of plastic, MLP plastic, to make a house for somebody? Is that even fair? How are you actually accounting for all these things? What about double accounting? Do we really, somebody said in the chat, we should stop calling carbon market a failure. But I think we need to call a spade, because if you're looking at, do we really have the governance mechanism to ensure market integrity? Arpita also talked about misuse of plastic credits, because all of this is allowing for greenwashing and misleading claims. Stakeholders, we talked about a lot of stakeholders. Where are the informal workers? How are we really looking at just transition? Why do we always fail to present the case? Data capturing is another problem. I think Siddharth mentioned it very well, where he said, with that graph that he mentioned, most EPR frameworks recommend establishing recycling infrastructure or collection points without even mapping existing recycling infrastructure in formal, informal, and private spaces. And what happens to that? It results in poor investment planning. It results in marginalizing the existing informal waste sector because all these things are not tracked. Some areas would receive more infrastructure, resulting in underutilization of existing infrastructure. Then there is lack of data availability as well, including enterprise structure. I know I have just 1 minute. I'm going to quickly wrap up. And also in terms of what are the contributions that are made by informal sector workers. Do we even really have like the realistic database? What are the statements that are being made by companies? How are they tracked? How are they reported? Can we fix a responsibility on them? Those are some of the questions that we still need to take. And then, what was the recycling jurisdiction in each location prior to the implementation of EPR? Lastly, when we're talking about focusing on the mobilization of climate finance, what we neglect is meaningful engagement with more national and subnational issues, which means we need to contextualize it. We need to be local. Just because somebody has issued a climate finance bond doesn't mean that we need to implement the same. I think that contextualizing is really, really important. In conclusion, if we look at EPR or other innovative finance mechanism in a linear, piecemeal approach, then we're never going to be able to turn into a reality. We have to plug in gaps, identify all stakeholders, craft a vision, and get to work. Data tracking, transparency is a key here. At the same time, the punitive measures for non-compliance must be strictly enforced. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pinky. And I think that was the best paced delivery ever. Thank you so much, panelists as well, and commentators. I see that you've been responding to a lot of questions in the Q&A, and in some ways that leaves us with a little bit of additional time to go back to some of the questions that we had left as food for thought. So I would like to just pose this one last question, I think as a key takeaway for people about these three questions that we had left them with in the middle of the session. So if I could ask Jean-Marc to please respond to the first question. How do we transform EPR from a waste management tool to a waste prevention mechanism, please?
Well, very quickly, as I presented, is by having EPR be part of a constellation of material management laws. So we need to have EPR being designed with a clear idea of how much waste do you think is acceptable in the near future, have prevention targets included, also have reuse targets, and then develop EPR as a tool to serve this higher ambition of actually how are we going to deal with this product that cannot be recycled, how do we want to increase reuse, how are we going to reduce waste. Otherwise, EPR in isolation will not deliver prevention or reuse.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that quick response. Next up, if we could have Siddharth speak about how EPR systems can be designed to ensure fair prices for waste workers and pickers as well as local governments, please. Thanks.
Yeah. So I think I'm no expert in EPR, unlike Jean-Marc and Dominic. But yeah, I can definitely comment from the perspective of the Indian EPR that we have. I mean, here, firstly, I mean, we have to recognize, in fact, there are several government documents by the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs, by the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change that do acknowledge the efforts of the waste workers, right? But when it comes to policy, we have simply ignored this entire workforce, which is responsible for managing a lot of plastic waste, if not all, right? So, I mean, just the fact that recognizing them, and not just waste workers, but also local governments, right? Because local governments are by law, I mean, they are mandated to deal with this activity. And then, I mean, if a law is centered around how the polluters can work with both of these workforces at the local government level and the waste workers, how they can also benefit from this entire, because as the scheme is being implemented, there's a small part in our report which also has kind of surveyed about 15 municipalities, and we were surprised to find that most of the municipalities are aware that okay, something like an EPR is being implemented, but how can they play a part? How can they play a role in all of this? Is something that's absolutely out of their knowledge. And if that is the case with local governments, then you can easily imagine how aware an average waste worker organization or a cooperative would be, right? So creating those avenues, creating those spaces, right? And also, like Pinky said, calling a spade a spade. I mean, I can keep coming back to this point again and again until and unless we invalidate the fake and fraudulent certificates that are present in the market is not going to correct itself. And it's very important because our EPR system is a market-driven system, right? So that's my response.
Much. And if I could direct the last question to Dominic, please. How can EPR systems deliver equitable outcomes in developing economies?
Thank you. Well, equitable outcomes in terms of, it's a difficult question, but I think it's if it's one of the interesting things is if you do push the distribution of costs more towards businesses, then yes, businesses may pass that on to consumers. But other things being equal, that means that consumers will be contributing to the costs in line with what they consume. So if you're somebody who's conscientiously seeking to avoid using packaging or plastics or whatever, then in principle, you won't pay anything towards that system. So it's fairer to people who are trying to do the right thing. EPR, as I've described it, doesn't lower costs per se. It just changes the distribution of who has to fund it. So in my view, it's a fairer way of doing it through putting the costs onto businesses and allowing them to deal with it. But at the moment, as many have said, we don't have a chance of doing that, because if we're going to rely on credit-based systems, they will not cover those costs, because that's not what the system's designed to do. And who gets the money?
Thank you so much, Dominic. I think our panel has had a whopper of presentations and a lot for the audience to digest. May I please invite you for a vote of thanks?
Thank you so much, Miko, Devyani, and all the panelists, Dominic, John Mark, Siddharth, Pinky, Damesh, Arpita. I mean, I was trying to internalize and digest. There's so much diversity in the discussion that we had today. And I'm now trying to understand how do we best utilize the outcome of this discussion to kind of communicate this where it matters the most. I'm sure that these kind of discussions eventually leads to very constructive and very meaningful discussion, and eventually it also plays a critical role in influencing and building public opinion, which is the need of the hour. So I can't thank you all enough. Thank you so much for joining us today. I mean, we were joined by a good number of participants, and these events were being live streamed in all the social media platforms. And I know for a fact that we are joined by a lot of people there who we cannot see here on the Zoom. So thank you all so much. And I mean, for the panelists, it's just a formality, but like the last INC, Siddharth and our team, we have been able to put together a massive report which basically maps all the countries of the world precisely 193 countries based on their positions across all the elements in the draft treaty. It's an infographic report which we are going to release on the 19th. That would be our last webinar in the series of run up to INC 5. So if possible, do register for the event and do come back and join us. And my request to all the participants is also to join us for the event on the 19th. And I hope we all will be meeting each other in the event in Busan. We are also doing a side event there. We are also putting up an exhibition booth. So colleagues from BFFP Gaya, we are happy to collect your materials and focus in our booth. That would be a great platform even for sharing and more discussions. So thank you all so much. And till we meet again, take care and stay safe.
Thank you.